dais, I just want to ask, are we all ready to begin our program? Yes. All right. Welcome, everybody. I want to welcome you to this afternoon's program titled Yndio Arxipelago, the Poetics of Media and the Promise of Poetry. I will be your host for this afternoon, Regina Regala, an assistant professor of the Department of Broadcast Communication. And of course, to start things off, I want to introduce our guest of honor, ang ating panauhing pandangal, with her welcome message, Dean Maria Josa Labiste. Opo, ma'am.
Mahirap yatang itong panauhing pagdangal. Really? Yeah, so it's okay. So magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat, to our guest speaker, Dorian, from our colleagues from the Department of Broadcast Communication, led by si LJ. Of course, Ellie and Alwin. Because I see Iris and Ivy and other colleagues. Yes, Jane, of course. Sa lahat. And also, where are students? Our students are just coming in. Pasok. The reps and the staff, magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat ulit. This legacy lecture series that we are holding this afternoon is part of our year-long celebration of the College of Media and Communications 60th anniversary. It's being led, by, of course, by this talk is being led, or this activity is being led by the Office of Research and Publication in partnership with different departments in our Film Institute. This legacy lecture series intends to invite selected senior faculty and alumni to discuss the college's pivotal role in their personal and professional development, but we also invite other prominent individuals who have made their mark in communication, media, and related fields. This is the sense of the word, or the idea of legacy. It refers to the lasting impact of media and communication, a person's life, and the public contribution that this person or this chosen lecturer will make in the years to come. So the talks, this is the second leg of the legacy lecture series. The first leg was about scholarly pursuits by our colleagues from the Communication Research Department. In that session, and I think today we wanted the speaker or us to interrogate media in relation to society, or media and society. We want the discussions to touch on how political, social, and technological shifts are transforming the media, and how media education impacts media innovation and ethics, and vice versa. This series aims to inspire current and future generations of media and communication students, scholars, and professionals to understand the increasing and complex world mediated and constructed by media. A related objective of these talks, this lecture series, to produce a publishable monograph from the lectures. Thus, we encourage the speakers to submit their lectures as an essay for publication. Okay, that this lecture series is part of our 60th anniversary, I said earlier, is something that we should be proud of, because it affirms our impressions that this college has been true to its mandate of excellent scholarship. Their students, the public, and this country will benefit from. Maraming salamat, and sa inyong lahat, magandang hapon.
Thank you po, Dean Josa, for the welcoming message. And I do stand corrected. Hindi po si Dean ang panauhing pandangal today, because apparently my reading comprehension this morning is a bit off. Okay, so to begin with, of course, let me officially introduce our actual panauhing pandangal, a person likely recognizable to most or all of you, dependent on Facebook posts and of course our media today, okay? Dorian S. Merina is a poet, journalist, and translator, and some of you might actually be familiar with him, probably being a student of his in semesters prior or the current semester in the BMAS program. He is the author of the Achichúk, Poems and Images from Batanes by Ateneo de Manila University Press, which was a winner of the 2020 Gintong Aklat Award and the finalist for the Philippines National Book Award. He also published 2 chapbooks of poetry titled Stone of the Fish and The Changegiver, and also released a spoken word album titled Heaven is a Second Language. As a journalist, he has been a producer, editor, and correspondent, and his work has been published in multiple outlets, including Jazeera, the New York Times, Miami Herald, the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, Caravan Magazine, and PRI's The World. He reported from Mexico, the United States, and throughout Southeast Asia on issues as varied as crime, sports, religious conflict, climate change, migration, and hip-hop. He is the co-founder of the community library Aklatan Savidug in Sabtang, Batanes, and teaches media studies here in our very own college at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He is a tribal member of the Ivatan people of the northern Philippines and is of mixed ancestry, specifically Filipino, Irish, and German ancestry. And you are all here actually to witness and hopefully take notes with regard to his the release of his book titled Yndio Arxipelago and its poetics. Hello, 110 students. Yes. Yndio Arxipelago is a new book from the UP Press, and it is a poetic narration that explores a critical moment in Filipino history. The encounter in the 16th century between indigenous people in the Philippines and the first European explorers. Through monologue, archives, and verse, yndio reimagines our shared and conflicted history of resistance, upheaval, and survival. This talk will explore the poetics of media, history, and narrative, how poetic language and the discipline of reading a text on poetic terms can offer new insights to our past and current media landscape. So especially for the students that have just arrived, this is the time you recall all your lessons in ideation class and also your history lessons from, well, if you're taking CAS. So yeah, good luck. Without further ado, our professor, also poet, journalist, and translator, Sir Dorian Merina. A round of applause, please.
Hello. Oh, very good. Magandang hapon sa atin lahat ngayong hapon. Salamat sa introduction from Professor Regina. Salamat na marami. Una sa lahat, gusto kong sabihin maraming salamat sa paanyaya ngayong hapon na maging bahagi ng talakayan natin. Salamat kay Dr. Patrick Campos, the director from the Office of Research and Publication, Dean Labiste from the UP College of Media and Communication, and congratulations to the college for 60 years, and here's to many, many more productive and inspiring years for our college here. To my colleagues for their inspirational scholarship, dedication to teaching and support. To the students who always bring curiosity and intelligence to our courses, kahit minsan may requests for extensions or, di ba? Pero palagi may dahilan. So, okay lang yan. Professor Neil Kenneth Chamandre, Assistant Director from the UP Press, and Dr. Zafra, and the rest of the excellent UP Press team for as I see it, taking a risk and being ambitious by publishing a book like this. Professor Aguirre, who will make some remarks and observations later on. I look forward to your observations. And to all of you for joining this event in person, or if you're viewing via video, welcome. I am both a journalist and a poet, and it's rare that I get the chance to talk in depth about these disciplines. So I am very, very excited to be here today and explore these topics with you. I've spent many times in newsrooms and writing for magazines and on production media teams, and I have experience, especially under pressure or under time deadlines, when you're writing copy or need to produce something, and you hear your editor or someone say, you know, what are you trying to be a poet? Don't write so poetically, you know? Get the copy out, you know? Sabihin mo yung pinaka-importanteng impormasyon para sa audience mo, right? So there's often this inherent conflict in our disciplines between media or media production and what's seen as more creative writing, like the poetic arts. And there are distinctions, there are important distinctions, but I would like to argue here that there are even more important connections and intersections that can bring insight, sometimes in surprising or unexpected ways, to both fields. And this is what I'm here to explore with you today. Poetry, I want us to think of poetry as a medium, as a different kind of medium. And in some ways it functions like other mediums. It transfers ideas, concepts, histories, emotions, informations. It seeks to engage with the reader or audience, and it relies on that audience to bring meaning to the text. If we take, for example, probably the most famous example of poetry in our national history, Mi Ultimo Adios, right, by Jose Rizal. It conveys, as a poem, it conveys information by conjuring a specific place, the homeland, the patria adorada, then a relationship of the speaker to that place, and it elicits strong emotions, a longing, a suffering, a desire for freedom, for liberation. But it also diverges as a text in important ways from other media of that time period. You know, we can think of the propaganda writings in La Solidaridad and other places that advocated for similar things, but because the voice in the poem is channeled through poetry, it operates differently. So poetry is a medium. It is distinct, and it carries interesting properties that deeply influence both the content and how that content is experienced. So let's look at some of the ways that poetry operates differently as a medium and how we experience it. The poet Robert Pinsky emphasizes that poetry is a vocal and a bodily art. What he means is that in order to understand how poetry works, it's critical to recognize that unlike some other art forms, like painting or film or photography, the medium of poetry is the human body, specifically the column of air inside the chest that then is shaped into signifying sounds in the larynx and the mouth. This is our voice. And when I first came across this concept by Pinsky, because I am a child of the 90s, and specifically hip hop from the 90s, I thought of the line from the great Mos Def and his album Black on Both Sides, where he says, "Speech is my hammer, bang the world into shape, now let it fall." And what he's saying there, one of the great MCs of our generation, he's talking about the physicality of artistic creation. And Pinsky is comparing poetry to these different art forms. So for example, dance. Both art forms rely on the body. But unlike dance, the medium in poetry is not an expert or a professional's body. In written poetry, the medium is the audience's body. This makes the experience of poetry not only physical, but unique and intimate. You know, for example, if I read the lines of Mi Ultima Adios, you know, Adios Patria Adorada, Región del Sol Querida. I am the one who is speaking those lines, right? It is coming to life through my voice and my body, my particular pitch and tone, my accent, my bodily persona, the personal history that I carry within me. Another aspect that makes poetry distinct as a medium, and this is related also to the physicality of it, is its reliance on rhythm and rhyme. And the Irish poet, William Butler Yeats, talks about rhythm and rhyme and its important function to sustain contemplation or rumination. And I would add to that, because I also come from a tradition of oral poetry, of oral recantation, is that rhythm, rhyme can also function as a memory device for the poet or the chanter. And for this, I draw also on another influence. I mentioned hip-hop. Another influence is the indigenous poetry of Batanes, which is where my family is from. And that is called laji. And it is orally composed and shared in a communal setting, in a social setting. And it also relies, in addition to rhythm and to rhyme, it relies heavily on metaphorical language. And this brings us to the third aspect of poetry I want to talk about, which is its reliance and its inspiration from metaphor. So in laji, the person who's speaking the poem can be a tree on a hillside overlooking the crashing ocean, or can be a fish that's carried home to be cared for in the shell of a coconut. And it's these metaphors that animate the poetry. Well, in metaphor, we can think of, what does this do when we speak through metaphor? It connects us in a deep linguistic way to the non-human world, to the spirits, to animals, to nature. It also expands our view and experience of the world in a temporal and a physical way. When we engage in metaphor, or with metaphor, or we use metaphorical thinking, we're pushing the boundaries of rational connections that have already been established. In other words, we are breaking new ground. We're also challenging our notion of how two things or multiple things can relate together, so that we need to reveal or reimagine the relationship between things. With metaphor, the power does not come usually from offering an answer, but rather by encouraging or pointing a way in a new direction towards a liberation of thinking. And it's especially important and useful when you're confronted with authoritarian powers, or powers seeking to stifle or control thought. And this is a central concern of media, journalism, and media studies, right? The freedom of thought and the freedom of expression. And it's no accident that throughout history, when poets have been faced with authoritarian regimes, they have relied on metaphor precisely to express their ideas, especially to indicate or to make reference to topics or ideas that are considered taboo, seditious, illegal. Metaphor is what provides an opening. So these are some characteristics of the medium of poetry, whether it is rhythm, rhyme, the physicality of the art form, metaphoric language. Let's turn, with these in mind, to the text we're talking about today, which is Yndio Arxipelago. And I want to talk about how I applied this art form and why I applied this art form to history and to the historical record. The book, Yndio Arxipelago, really focuses on a narrow period of time, really, from 1560s through the first decade of 1600. So it's really, for the most part, focused on just the 40 years of the initial contact, conquest, confrontation between European explorers, church officials, and the indigenous population throughout the Philippines and somewhat Southeast Asia. It's a time of great conflict, and also I wanted to explore it because it's a time of transformation. And I feel like with our history, we can see the legacy today, even though it may not always be apparent. We can see the currents that come from this particular period of time. And when I was researching the sources that went into this, which was a long process that went on many years, I kept coming across these interesting moments in history. And I'll just mention a couple. One is called the Manila Synod of 1582. And this is when the first bishop in the Philippines, Bishop Domingo Salazar, arrived here barely 10 years after the conquest began. And he was deeply troubled by the accounts of abuse, corruption, and we can think about threads to our current times, contemporary times, our challenges with corruption today. He was troubled by this corruption, the abuse, the treatment of indios, of the native peoples. So he called together this meeting in Manila. He brought all the clergy together, church officials, and also administrative officials to try to reckon with the situation. You know, think about it. They're not even 20 years after the conquest, and there's a crisis because from his point of view, he's saying, how can we spread our religion? How can we convert? How do we have the moral right to do that when we are also responsible for these tremendous abuses that are taking place? So what comes from that meeting is several documents. One is called a handbook for the confessors. And it's really a guide for church officials who are dealing with people coming in for confession. And how do they handle this? How do they handle this moral and religious dilemma? And what we get from these documents is specific accounts of terrible abuse taking place, of corruption, but also the interesting discussion that's taking place around it and how do we resolve it. So I was exploring these documents and trying to figure out a way to make them relevant for us today, for readers today. You know, why is this important for us today? A second episode, which we're probably familiar with, is the Manila galleon trade, right? This began in the 16th century. It lasted 250 years. It really was revolutionary in connecting Asia, China, Manila, other parts to the Americas, right? And specifically to the coast of Mexico and specifically to Acapulco. And then, importantly, I think it came back. So there's a cultural trade and interaction that's coming from America into the Philippines as well. And I wanted to explore that connection we have, not necessarily to Europe, which has been well documented and talked about, but to indigenous America and to the Nahuatl language and to the native peoples in Mexico, which have their own very interesting history. At that point in time, we were very closely linked because the Philippines was governed through Mexico. The legal issues went through Mexico. A lot of the church discussion and decisions went through Mexico, not to Spain directly, right? So these are a couple things. And when I was confronted with these documents and how do we explore these creatively, I sought to unlock these connections through poetry and through the poetic form. So I'd like to provide just 3 quick examples from Indio and how poetic form helped me tell the story. And I have a couple slides, up here. Very nice. So this first one is titled The Baybaylan Speaks, okay? And this is a figure in our history you're probably familiar with. This is based on a specific persona, actually, documented by a Jesuit missionary in the 1660s in Visayas. And this missionary was focusing on men who did not conform to European standards of gender expression. The historical record is in the Jesuit missionary's voice. So I wanted to explore the voice of the Baybaylan, the silenced voice in history. And the Jesuit priest documents his informant as a mute, as someone who did not speak, literally did not speak. And I really struggled with this poem in particular for a long time, and I will talk a little bit after. I think maybe I'll just read the poem and then I'll talk about why I chose this form. So this, you could think of this as the Baybaylan responding. When you have told me all that you desire, to know the cost and creed behind our laws, I will beckon and conjure in these hours the thunder of a mute and all its fire. It's true my hair is braided to my waist, my shoulders dip and sway in lethal runs. I am the wicked variant, I have become all you fear in what your God mandates. And yet I know the prayers on sea and land, the ones you've brought, the ones you've sought to burn. The hidden blades rise at my command. Is this not what you've come to learn? My lips have moved, but silence is my reign. The earth grows parched. You will be back again. And he is back again because there's a number 2 in the poem, in the book as well. But you know, these Baybaylan figures in our history, the church officials came and they were deeply troubled and challenged by the Baybaylan figure, by the shaman, by the spiritual figure, where the native people had primarily women who were the spiritual leaders and the carriers of shamanic tradition and spiritual teachings. But then there's also a space in there for other people, men who performed as women or expressed as women or expressed in a feminine way, and that was accepted and not just tolerated but revered. And this was a deeply troubling to many of the church officials, right? I really struggled with how to write this poem, and it was never sounding right, and this went over months and months and months. And should it be a monologue? Should it rhyme? Should it not? Should it da-da-da-da-da? And it was not until I discovered this form that it unlocked for me. And if we look at it closely, we can see some rhymes right at the end. Desire, fire. Then the second and third line, laws, hours. Then the next, waste, mandates, runs, become. So what we're discovering here is quatrains, right? 4 lines. There's a quatrain, there's a quatrain, there's a quatrain. It ends with a couplet, right? With 2 end rhymes that end. Now, this may be starting to sound familiar. It's 14 lines. What is it? What kind of form? It's a sonnet. It's a sonnet, right? It's a sonnet. And where does the sonnet come from? It originally comes from Italy. It's an Italian form. But who really made it famous in the English language? Shakespeare. And when was Shakespeare writing? Right at this time period, at the end of the 1500s and the first decade of the 1600s. It's when he was really making the sonnet into an English language form and using it as a form of expression of romantic love or dedication or longing, and really perfecting it, right? So when I started exploring the sonnet during this time period, it kind of unlocked how to channel this voice of the Baybaylan into a European form, but using this very specific structure. And what did that provide? It provided for me just the right amount, I think, of tension, where this persona is speaking, and yet there is a constrainment where he's speaking within a European structure of poetic dialogue, of poetic speaking, right? So I just wanted to highlight this as an example of where poetry can offer something, a new avenue perhaps, or a new way of expressing when we look at the historical record and we're exploring the historical record in a creative way. The second example is called "We Hold It as Certain in These Our Lands." And right away we can look at it, it's a visual poem. If I read from the left, it says, "We hold it as certain in these our lands, that if one were not to proceed, as we have endured countless trespasses, with the superiority and force and violations, and caution in order, not only against our families, our homes, our villages, but against even the land itself." And it continues. What we find from reading this is it's actually a dialogue of two voices. The voice on the left, if we read it, it's the voice of the Spanish official, the soldier, the administrator. The voice on the right is the voice of the indio. What we have as a reader when we start looking at it is we're faced immediately with a decision as a reader. Should I read straight across? Or should I read the column first and then the second column? Right? So right away we're engaged in this decision. And then we discover that there's actually two voices speaking. They're in confrontation with each other. There's conflict, and yet they complete each other's sentences in a certain way. They complete the verse, and then they unify in these lines that are in the center, where it's "be any memory of it at all." To be allowed free government is the last line. And really this is a debate over whether or not the native population has the moral right to govern itself. And the voice on the left is making the case that they do not, and the voice on the right is advocating for its own self-government, right? So again, there's a tension in here, but this poem, a different kind of form, a different form of expression, is offering a different experience with the historical record. The text on the left is actually from the historical record verbatim, which I cite in the notes. The text on the right is imagined, and they interact together in that way. And that's another poetic form that we find in the book. And the last one I will share is this the funnest one to write and read? Seguro. These are called redacted poems, or you could think of these as, they're called erasure poems. They're in the tradition of documentary poetry. And what you do is you take a document that already exists in the public domain or in history or somewhere, and you use the process of redaction or omission to challenge the text or to find a new meaning in it, right? And this one has, I think, strong correlations with journalism in some way. I've been in many times when I request, or my newsroom requests under Freedom of Information Act, public documents in order to expose wrongdoing, right? Or in order to let the public see what an organization is doing or an agency of power is doing, and what you get back from them is this heavily redacted document. And their intention is to omit or to impose secrecy. And what I wanted to do with these poems is do something similar, but with the power dynamic kind of inversed, where instead of the power structure omitting and keeping us from understanding things, I wanted to use redaction in order to challenge the dominant narrative and produce something or instigate something else. So this document is from that 1582 meeting that I referred to earlier, that Manila Synod. They produced documents, and this document is probably the foundational or most important one, because in order for them to justify the conquest, they first had to convince themselves and everyone else that who they ran into in the Philippines, the pagans, the non-Christians, had no existing form of self-government or self-rule. Because if they did, that would invalidate the entire conquest, right? You cannot forcibly invade a sovereign nation, right? At least under their idealistic rules. So this document says the first condition of finding people who rule and govern themselves, at least in substance, is difficult. Because as these pagans are in such darkness and blindness, and so abandoned and forgotten by God, and in such little light concerning natural things about which they have no writings, teachings, or doctrine. And it continues on into the bottom, it says, it is necessary, as with an old building, to take it apart and burn it totally, so that the faith may be taught to these pagans so distant from the good and the just. And this is a part of a series of poems that use the redaction technique to try to interrogate the historical record and try to bring some new or interesting insight to the historical record. All of these forms that I am bringing up here, the sonnet or the dialogue in opposition to each other, or the erasure poems, they help point to multiple layers or dimensions. There's a text emerging or being obscured by a text. There's multiple meanings available to the reader. And the reader is called on to take an active role in meaning making. Finally, in conclusion, I will just say discussions and conversations about poetry can often get very complicated. So I always like to go back to a simple and direct explanation of what poetry does from the poet June Jordan. And she says, poetry means taking control of the language in your life. And this means, in the most basic sense, taking responsibility for and power from the language that we use and we engage with. It's akin to, I think, in our media theory classes, if you think about that, Stuart Hall's foundational theory, really, about reception theory, about media production and the creation of an audience, and so forth. Another way to think about it is that language can manipulate, language can control, but it also can liberate. And engaging in a poetic practice challenges us to constantly think about the language we are using and that is being used to control or persuade us, its roots, its motivations, its effect in our minds and our thought. Poetry potentially offers us the chance to forge a deeper understanding about events and often opens into a deeper inquiry. Because for me, a poem is not an end. It's not a terminal location. Instead, it is a portal. It is a gateway to a profound and unique voyage that can be surprising, comforting, troubling, or entertaining, but always one that leaves us more awakened, changed, and transformed. And this was my hope with Yndio Arxipelago. Maraming salamat.
Thank you po, Sir Dorian. I am in awe. The lit major in me is a very happy camper. I know that the next portion is about reactions to be conducted by Sir Alwin Aguirre. So, Sir Alwin, you may take your place here to react. But I just want to say that my facial reactions while Sir Dorian was speaking a while ago were facial responses of awe, amusement, and he really made me feel smart. Like, a lot of things are like making a lot of sense right now in relation to well, the creative process, also an understanding of form, a well-informed understanding of history, and of course, lastly, a consideration of the reader. So we'll talk about a lot of that later. I would like to introduce our reactor for this afternoon, Sir Alwin Aguirre, a professor from my same department, my former chair, who will now take his place. Sir, sa podium po ba kayo or upo po kayo? Ganun na lang po. Okay po. May mic din. Dito na lang po.
Maraming salamat, Dorian, and thank you for the ORP College of Media and Communication and of course the Department of Broadcast Communication for this wonderful, wonderful occasion. Serendipitously, the examples provided by Dorian are also the examples I use in my reaction. So what he said, I agree with them. That's the gist of my reaction, okay? But if you would like a more profound one, I'd be reading from my notes. Okay. Dorian Merina's new collection of poems, Yndio Arxipelago, published by the UP Press in 2025, is painful to read. Painful here is in quotes and perhaps should be unpacked to more clearly express what I would like to say about the experience of immersing in Merina's poetry, this collection. It is full of pain. Further, I should make it clear that to say that the collection is painful to read is a compliment at this juncture that we share in terms of our overwhelming and seemingly unending battle with the reclamation of our past, the continued attacks against our identity, and our effortful recuperation of that enigmatic sense of self, and the reverberations of historical epistemic violence enacted on the national psyche that is unceasing in its control of our present political and cultural life in this country, which currently has been deemed as mahirap mahalin. Okay. To speak of Yndio Arxipelago as a welcoming of pain is to summon its emotional complement, which is love. Putting it more bluntly, to love is to be open to pain, right? To be worthy of love and loving is to offer pain some indulgence. It is the inevitable pairing of love and pain that drives narrative plots, including the tale of our journey toward modernity as the main project of the story of the nation. In both our personal and national lives, love and pain are an indefatigable pairing. This long quote from C.S. Lewis, I was thinking of a quote to use for love. My favorite one has always been Janet Winterson's, "Why is the measure of love loss?" But it's not what I'm using today. Okay. I'll be using a longer quote from C.S. Lewis in The Four Loves. It provides some resonance but also a caveat against rejecting such hurtful necessity. Medyo mahaba. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. Okay. Nakaiyak ang love, no? Nakaiyak talagang mahal eh, okay. I wonder in which cases one can relate much more closely to this quote. Is it when speaking of one's personal experience of love, i.e. being heartbroken? Or is it when one thinks of how one regards bigger ideas such as the nation? Either way, C.S. Lewis is highlighting one important point about the possibility of loving. It is an invitation to vulnerability, to being broken, to being destroyed. To use post-structuralist jargon, 123, to love is to give in to deconstruction. Whether one speaks of personal or national love, the idea of love leading to one's vulnerability or deconstruction underscores love's heaviness. its hefty price, but also, at least if Lewis is to be believed, its counter-offer amidst all these sacrifices, one's redemption or one's salvation. Merina, of course, as all poets do, does not speak of love directly in the collection, right? Because poets are like that. But in keeping with C.S. Lewis's invocation of vulnerability in dealing with love, Yndio Arxipelago is a submission to entanglements. In the quote, we are given a way out of love, hence, toward an avoidance of pain. That is, being free of all entanglements. Merina's new collection is the exact opposite of that. In fact, what he aims to do is to ensnare the reader in all sorts of entanglements: symbolic, stylistic, generic, semiotic, philosophical, and historical. It is due to this overarching character of the collection that I prefaced my speech today with the claim that the book is painful, but it is not a pain to read. Each piece in the collection demands commitment from the reader in terms of time, energy, and cerebral resources. To say that the collection is intellectual is only partly true, though. Indeed, what Merina offers is thinking poems, not in the elitist sense, but in an act of at once supplication and admonition. Merina, on one hand, requests some favor from the reader to spend serious time in the reading process. In the same breath, he also issues a reminder that to lose sight of serious consideration of our historic and historical encumbrances, we risk our continued subsistence in repeated political and cultural mediocrity. I would consider the collection as scriptable or writerly text, to use Barth's terms. Okay. As opposed to the listenable or readerly ones, writerly texts tend to be more challenging since their meanings refuse to linger on the surface. Writerly texts, such as the poems in Merina's current collection, require serious attention. It is, however, not about the text being difficult per se. Rather, it is about the extent to which we, as readers, are willing to offer it our time, our energies, and ourselves. It is indeed about the reader opening herself up to the vulnerabilities of writing and rewriting the texts in the act of reading. The poems in Yndio Arxipelago demand commitment from the Filipino reader because the subject matter of the entire book is not insubstantial. It is, after all, an attempt at enlightenment and reigniting the desire to truly know who and where the Filipino and her nation stands in the present world. As a largely modernist experimentation in form and interrogation of the subject of the nation, Merina affords us a vicarious affinity with his very personal and specific take on Filipino identity and the Philippine nation as a Filipino whose Filipino-American background entangles quite complexly with the search for his ethnic and national roots and belonging as one of Ivatan heritage. His efforts is in consonance with the artistic and literary tradition of repossessing our history, identity, and nationhood from the vestiges of colonial atrocities. He does this quite eloquently using the tools of stylistic experimentation and intertextuality, resulting in an amalgamation of forms and genres and polyphony of voices that rightfully recenters the imagined presences of our ancestors in the face of colonial attacks. In Bactrian language, polyphony cultivates a multiplicity of voices, with each carrying its own agenda and baggage as an inescapable effect of historical consciousness and the politics of remembering. If we could flash again the slide on to hold it certain. Yeah, yung naka-cross. What slide number is that? Sorry, Kuya Alex. Yung slide lang na may poem na dalawa. Yan, very good. Thank you. We hold it as certain in these our lands. This is a perfect example of a polyphonic, rendering in poetry. Dorian explained himself that this is about multiple voices converging into, into this one particular piece. Pwede po ba natin siyang i-zoom in para mas mabasa ng mga tao? Just the text. Could we zoom in to the text? Yeah, very good. Yan, tapos pa-scroll up ng konti. Ayan, very good. Thank you. Okay na po yan. So Dorian was telling us a while ago that this is like, two voices speaking against or to each other. It's hard to imagine that. Well, let's perform it. Okay. This side of the room shall read this side. This side of the room will read this side. And we end in this line, okay? But we do it all at the same time. This side, this side, this side, this side. 1, 2, 3, go!
Behold it as certain.
Hindi kayo marunong magbasa? Okay. Yes, sabay-sabay.
Kasi paliwanag.
To me, the poem is written in that way. You read it at the same time. I don't know how you do it, but since we are here, we could read it at the same time. 1, 2, 3, go!
We hold it as certain that if one were not to proceed with a superiority in force and caution in order, to restrain them and assure the recent converts, so that they do not turn back from the preachers and the rest who accompany and support this new Christian commonwealth. It would not exist or have grown or been nourished, nor would there perhaps be any memory of it at all.
That's very good, and that's how I imagine it in my head, actually. So, if you are someone who's just listening, it's a how do you call it? It's crazy. It's madness when you listen to that kind of dialogue that is overlapping. In a sense, para kang nakikinig ng pasyon. Rosaryo na paulit-ulit, pero sabay-sabay yung mga tao at iba't iba yung dinarasal nila. Okay. So let me go back to the notion of polyphony. In Bactrian language, polyphony cultivates a multiplicity of voices, with each carrying its own agenda and baggage, as an inescapable effect of historical consciousness and the politics of remembering. It is because of this surfacing of the multiplicity of voices in many of the pieces in the collection that makes them impossible to be read aloud by the reader on their own. In silence, one could invoke the polyphonic body of the poems as different voices speaking at the same time in one's head. And that was how I imagined it. Each one staking a claim, each one insisting on a reality, each one claiming a truth. One can imagine how difficult this feat is as an act of performance if done by one's lonesome. Perhaps Merina was sending out a message that it is in keeping with his poetry's aim, to recite the mantra of our rewritten past in solidarity with our kapwa. Yndio Arxipelago is a potential encounter with pain, of course, but also because it forces the reader to let go of literalism despite the literal use of a diversity of forms. For example, Spanish-era prayers, Doctrina Christiana, historical text like the one in the redacted poetry, anthropological documents, for example, the hojas in the collection referencing the Boxer Codex. So, the book is an indictment of the recently developed habit of unidimensional and instantly gratifying cultural forms rampant in new media. While it can be argued that the meaningfulness of any text resides in the reader, evidence also shows how current media content has altered our cognitive and behavioral patterns. Merina's new poems could serve as an antidote to such comfortable but discomfiting habitual new media practice, as they require poetic thinking, which does not necessarily pertain to the poetic form alone, but to the capacity to see connections in seemingly disparate elements. In other words, to acknowledge entanglements and then make sense of them. As students of media, what we are reminded of in engaging with Yndio Arxipelago is that both poetry and media making are enterprises in representation, using language in its liberal sense, not only in making things clear, but also in questioning whether what we see as clarity is actually a muddying of the truth. Media as poetic entry into the vernacular sensibilities of people, it is always a teaching moment for reflecting on the ineffable as a necessary feature of hard-edged reality. If done sensibly, popular media is capable of softening the edges of rigid understanding of realities in everyday life, so that the audience is able to decipher the ruse of those in power in their attempt at fixing meanings with no supposed alternatives. But again, this is not an easy task. I extract one of Merina's poems in the collection, Xylograph 1593, to demonstrate the excruciating effort at rescripting our sense of the past, where beseeching the blessings of the heavens is to be revealed as an enactment of both subservience and subversion. You could go get a copy and see the poem, in its entirety, but I excerpt a particular part here. By force or persuasion, I coax the lines and curves in reverse, summoning from the blocks the lock and key. Pray for us sinners. In the end, the prayer comes from where you cannot see. Yndio arxipelago as a whole is a rewriting of history and a rebirthing of a sense of self. It is forcing faulty notions of how we have understood ourselves as Filipinos out of our system and reducting them out of our psychology, not for the sake of forgetting, but in contrast to reconstitute our remembering. The poems are painful because being born again, that is, reclaiming a historical rebirth that comes from voices previously silenced and fantasies long forgotten, will always be painful, especially since the initial step is choosing to participate in an exercise where pain is the premise of honoring our already difficult lives. Maraming salamat po.
All right. The floor will be open for other reactions later, hopefully in the form of questions. For this next section, of course, I would like to invite Sir Alwin and Sir Dorian actually back onto the stage so that they can sit beside each other and you can be witness to their reactions to each other. Okay. Of course, while they're settling down over here, I would like to invite our audience to take a stand, to use the mic over there in the center aisle if you have any questions, concerns, and violent reactions. Kidding. Of course.
This is actually Dorian's event, so your question should be addressed to Dorian.
Should be addressed to Sir Dorian. Okay. And if you are shy, don't worry. We have some questions already. Well, naka-imbak na. So, and sorry to put pressure on my students because they are taking 110 ideation and BMAS 123, and some of them happen to be here. So maybe this is the best platform for them to ask those questions. But to start things off, I really just want to ask Sir Dorian, how to be you po? I guess it is a poetics question. I actually noted it while I was listening to your portion. I noticed that there was a lot of research that went into the process of creating this series or this suite of poems. And I was curious, which actually came first? Like, was it the urge to write the poems? Or like, did you happen upon these research materials about the Manila Synod and the Babaylans and etc., and then the poems came after that?
Magandang tanong. Malalim.
You're welcome.
Maganda. Dapat siya ay sumagot siguro.
Wala akong nalaman.
To be truthful, the research has gone on a really, really long time. Some of these poems were originally written more than 20 years ago. Some, not all. And so we were just talking briefly, and I don't have formal training as a poet, but I have been doing poetry since I was 19 or so, 20. But I came up in as I mentioned, the tradition of spoken word, hip hop, where your audience is right in front of you and you have to refine your skills right away. And then since then, as I mentioned, also the oral tradition of my family's background. So that's more of my background, and then it required a lot of individual study on my own as well. This specific collection, to answer the question, it really did come from an inquiry, a yearning to understand our history and understand my own place in it as somebody in the diaspora, as somebody who was raised primarily in California, Los Angeles. I was raised in a mixed background where my family is German-Irish, my family's Filipino, and I have a Mexican side as well. And I really wanted to understand my own relationship to the Philippines and my own family's forced migration out of the Philippines and our return and so forth, which led me to some of this original research into understanding how identity was forged during the 16th century and onwards. So I would say, first of all, did come that impulse to search, to find information and sources. And then, as I developed my own voice in poetry and my own skills in poetry and my own understanding of poetic forms and how they could operate and work, I started incorporating that and channeling some of this research through that and try to express it in that way. And it really did not crystallize completely until the last couple years, when I really focused on making it a collection, like a cohesive collection that would make sense altogether.
Okay, thank you, sir. Oh, nagtanong na ako. All right, are there any other questions? Feel free to take up the mic. Anyone? I'm sure there are quite a few of you who like writing poetry. Oh, go ahead, Sir Ellie.
Gusto ko lang i-narrate yung experience kanina, yung pinampas ni Ali, nung magpasa ng tula, no? Ng dalawang in an oral culture style. Because when I was sinisimula sa itong basahin kanina, while you were making a presentation, ay pinabasa ko siya from a print culture. Is the way it is written here. Dalawang magkaiwalay, but two voices, but voices may give each voice, but would eventually be part of one sentence. But in a print style, it could be read na the first volume first, before you proceed to this one, and then or the next page would be reading the second column. Pero hindi ko siya mabasa ng pinagsabay. But when Alvin prompted me, asked, to read the text, in that manner. Sabi ko, now, actually, nung pinapakinggan ko rin, sabi ko, this is a completely different immersion to the text. Sabi ko, this is so oral, the oral culture, and yet, tapos, hindi ko na ma-sense yung print culture. So, dinala ako nung prompt ni Alvin doon sa oral culture na at ang tunog nga sa akin, Rosario, at naalala ko ngayon yung ibang mga epics, na hindi ko nasa-sense pero may pakiramdam lang, So, two types or multiple types of experiences. One may be the print culture and then that sensory, yung iba pang aspect, mula sa'yo, Dorian, at alam, ginagawa mo yon, was lalo na kung iba pang wika yung nakalagay dito, kung yung original text na ginagamit natin, So, nandun yung complex layering of so many language, blah, 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 down the line, Kaya nga sabi ko, ang painful in that sense, in other words, dinidesign mo siya ganon talaga. Dinisign mo din ba siya sa kung paano kami pinamp kanina ni Alwin? At ganun din ba yung nasa utak mo, yung mga tunog na gumagalaw sa utak at puso habang ito ay sinusulat?
Actually, para sa akin din, maganda talaga yung karanasan kanina na lahat tayo ay participating in the voicing, right? I originally envisioned this as a performative text. So there are multiple voices speaking at once. That was how I originally thought of it. But I also, part of me as a poet is very practical. So I know that most people will be encountering this on the page. So I want it to work on the page as well. And I want there to be multiple options. So if you come to it, you need to, it's a choose your own adventure poem, You need to decide, am I going to isolate this first voice? Am I going to skip over that space and include the second voice? Or am I going to read them? So you, in a sense, are part of the creation of the poem and of the experience. But my original vision, to answer your question, was a performance where there are actually two people speaking, two voices speaking, simultaneously overlaying multiple layers, and then at some points they come together and unify. So I would say thank you for doing that. I wasn't expecting that experience, but that was that's how you thought of it first when you came across it.
A lot of the poems in the collection actually, to me, are spoken in multiple voices, not just this one. It's just that this is a perfect example of that when performed. Of course, when I was reading this particular poem, I couldn't read them simultaneously in multiple voices. But in my head, I could imagine this is how it will sound. Because this is on the surface, multiple voices speaking through, against, to each other. And I'm glad that this event happened because I was able to experience the poem in its its partial full realization. But the entire collection is actually a collection. It is a concatenation of many voices. Even Dorian's example of the Babaylan Speaks, that is actually it's a good thing that Dorian explained it. This is actually a response to a particular speech, right, or a particular discourse, and an imagined response to it. So and that is why my premise is, and this may sound funny to Dorian, but he thought I was kidding when I said, you know what, my opening is that your collection is painful. It is painful because you'd have to really get outside of yourself to be able to imagine how complex the layers of voices are in the poetry, in the poems. And you can't have the collection, you can't read the collection otherwise. It is not a collection for easy reading. It is a collection for deep contemplation. Because that's what the collection demands from us. Of course, the rhythm and the lines are are delicious in a sense when you read them. But aside from that, you really have to ruminate on so many things that Dorian was trying to say in each of the pieces in the collection.
Sa una, narinig ko, it's a painful read, sabi ni Alwin. Sabi ko, wag mong sabihin yan, it's a painful read. Nobody wants to experience that, but I will just say, I'm really heartened and I love the way you brought it together in, as what we hope as writers and poets is that there are readers who take something from it and experience something and pay attention. And I actually love the way that Professor Alwin brought it together into the other side of it is love, right? And we make space for that through pain often, and we can't avoid it sometimes, and we need to experience it, confront it, right? So it's quite an interesting concept. So I guess siguro okay.
That's your reaction.
Siguro okay. That's my reaction.
Any other questions? I'm gonna count 5. Go, Tony, go ahead.
Hello. Hello po. I'm Tony from BMAS and also Com 130 class. I'm currently taking CAS kasi. So, ayun. I found this very interesting na yung dinidiscuss nung like yung book mo, it's about the history of the Philippines. And you mentioned kanina na writing this collection took a while. I'm wondering, why did it like take so long to write yung ganitong type ng literature?
Ang tagal daw, Dory.
Ang tagal. Mabagal ako talaga. Mabagal ako.
Demanding si Tony.
Dapat mag-publish agad. No, I would just mention, because I know a lot of us are writers and a lot of us are aspiring writers perhaps and everything. Even now, and I have, been fortunate enough to publish books, to get my work out and so forth. Even now, my work is still rejected by places. I fail. Work is turned back to me. And so I just want to make that point, that as an artist, you always have this process of ongoing, you have a process of failure, you have a process. So I just want to make that point, because I know when I was a young writer, it was always like, you know, how am I get my work out there, and how do they, you know, get published and so forth. So I just want to bring up that, you know, real dimension to the creative process. While I'm working on this, it's not the only thing I'm working on. You know, sometimes, no, I don't want to have the picture for 20 years. I'm sitting in my room, you know. Ay, nako. But sometimes, hey, in creative projects, you know, it's very different than being in the newsroom, right? You cannot, if you tell your editor, I'm still working on that magazine article 10 years ago, you know, hindi pa tapos, you know, sorry. Hindi pwede. So in the creative process, sometimes work takes a long time, you know, and there's a mystical element to it also. And sometimes what I like about the creative process is we're not fully in control all the time. We need to open up to our intuition. And I feel like this took so long because I needed to experience things, and I needed to learn more. I needed to learn more about our language. I needed to learn more. This launched me on a whole study of Baybayin. I had to learn Baybayin. I took it seriously. I practiced. I took time, not just like little characters, but really in a deep way. It was important to me to understand that. That takes time. I needed to deepen my understanding of the Spanish language of that time period. You know, I knew Spanish, I used it in my reporting and so forth, but really a deeper way. I needed to deepen my knowledge of Tagalog, Filipino. So I think this kind of work took me a long time because I wasn't ready to write the poems the way they needed to be written. And so it took time to get to that point, to be able to pull them all together and have the perspective, knowledge, and understanding, I think, to put it together. And minsan, you know, you have projects that take that long. So, siguro kaya.
Go po din.
Thank you, Dorian, for this wonderful afternoon discussion. I'm interested about the redacted poems, because in journalism, redacting something from the text is a form of censorship, but you do it as a form of subversion or intervention to the text. But I'm also now beginning to be curious, what are the words that being, you know, blackened, and why didn't you, you know, also provide a version to make it like a palimpsest and make us see the words that are being, you know, taken away, being censored or being subverted, for us to know the extent to which oppression during the colonial period actually was done to the natives or to Filipinos or free Filipinos. Like make it more immersive as a text.
Mm-hmm.
Plus 5 years.
Mm-hmm. Plus 5 more
25 years.
25 years, okay. Mayroon pa. May isa pang project. In general, I would say, because this book draws on a lot of primary texts, as I put in the back of the book, out of the respect I have and admiration I have for scholarship, for historians, I try to do my best to indicate to the reader when the text comes from another source and what that source is, and then when the text comes from my own imagination. I think that's really very important. So that's why in the end of this book, the notes section is quite extensive, because it was really important to me. Even specific lines, I indicated the source, the page number, the author, etc., because that's very important, I think. With respect specifically to the redacted poems or the erasure poems, there are poets who make the point that any form of erasure onto a text is an act of violence to that text. And that is a good point. I acknowledge that point. That's true. because the original author, you are erasing their intention, right, and their meaning. There are different ways to do it. So for these, I will say I did give the full text, the source of the full text for readers who are interested. I didn't have room to put it directly in the book, but it's there for anyone who, the full translation for anyone who's interested. There are different ways to do it, and I'm thinking in the future, I will do it this way, where you have the text and your line to cross out is a thinner line, so the reader can see the original text behind what you've redacted.
Or a transparent page.
Pwede rin. Mahal yan. Mahal yan. UP Press, kaya ba? Or transparent press, the transparent page. So you can do that. And as a reader, I have appreciated that because you can see the original text. It was important for me in this, all the redacted forms are hand redacted. And that's my hand with pen. And I really wanted to have that textual, tactile feel to it. And the pen I was using is a marker pen to do it. So that's part of the reason, is I wanted that. And the other reason is, as I mentioned, although I feel that in journalism often the documents we seek to get are redacted, and it is a form of censorship because the public doesn't have access to these important things. What I'm trying to do with these is take documents that were used in history to oppress people or to exclude people or to justify violence against people. And I was trying to, through redaction, provoke different ways of perhaps understanding the authors behind them or their meaning. So I do feel like there's not a clean-cut answer to the process of redaction, the technique of redaction, because it's quite complex and it can lead to a lot of ethical questions. But I do think the way you do it needs to keep in mind all the issues that come into play when you're doing erasure in poetry.
Can I respond briefly? Because it's an interesting subject matter. I think we could also look at it from the point of view of seeking to redeem ourselves from the violence of reduction that has been enacted on us by those who claim to have chronicled who we were, right? So I think the reduction here is not actually just a reaction to that particular kind of violence, but a recuperation of that particular sense of dignity and sense of self that was reduced because we were written for by or written about by the colonizers. So it is not an act of censorship in this particular case. I don't think so. It is actually an act of insistence, right? That your text reveals your actual intent when you colonized us in the guise of saving us from being from an uncivilized state. So it's probably also I think it's a more productive way of reading that particular kind of poetry or generic form, because the power of reduction here is in response to the reduction that was made of us by that colonial experience.
Ang ganda po. Gusto ko rin mag-react. Hindi po. Mag-react yung MC. Actually, wala lang. Before the next... Who has the next question? Na-pressure kayo. No, Jane, go ahead.
So, good afternoon. I'm Jane from BMAS. I was very curious about what the work means to you as a mixed person. Like, does the fact or your experience or life as mixed Filipino and European ever impact or change the way you learned or wrote about Philippine history? So, yun po.
Yes, I mean, I think being mixed or having mixed ancestry, mixed life experience, mixed family background absolutely influences the way I live here in the Philippines, the way I interact with my family, the way I am a Filipino, you know. I have particular historical background, you know. My grandfather, who was a guerrilla fighter during World War II, joined the U.S. military, and that's why he was able to transport his family abroad to Okinawa, to Japan, and then to military bases across the U.S., right? So that forms part of my background as well. My grandmother on my mother's side, I do recall she was very fond of limericks. That's an Irish tradition. Beautiful poetic tradition, and she would read those to us, and we would interact with that, and so forth. I already mentioned Laji. So even in literary ways, right, all these are kind of influences, right? And that is part of me. And just as I walk through the Philippines, how people interact with me, as a mixed person, you know, it influences your experience. The other dimension I would add to that is thinking of identity. I like to think of identity not necessarily as the labels that we carry with us, but rather belonging or affinity. So what communities do we belong to? What communities claim us? You know, what communities do we participate in, and are we part of? And I think, to me, that's a deeper meaning, a deeper sense of who we are. And this doesn't need to be race and ethnicity. This can be all different kinds of things that form our own communities, right? And I think those are important to acknowledge as they come out in your writing as an artist. But I would say that being a mixed person and often feeling outside, feeling in the margins, in a social situation or in a cultural situation, can be painful, but it also, well, pain, the whole thing is painful, diba? But it can also give you a different point of view, and I think that helps us as artists sometimes. So I do embrace that as well.
I think we have time for one more question from our audience. Does anyone want to ask a question? Uy, nahiya sila. Okay, nahiya sila. I have one more question, sir. Don't worry. Meron akong... Po, sir? Meron po si Ronin? May challenge po, sir?
Si Ronin daw may question.
Ah, okay po. Ronin, may question ka? Okay. Yun yung challenge. Actually, I guess as a final question is, we've been talking about poetry and the literary aspect of creation and poetics this whole time. And you actually started your talk a while ago with this false convention that literature and journalism, or the creative and the practical arts, don't really merge with each other. And that's debunked, right? So I guess the question that I want to ask, to bring it back to, well, our locale, which is the media, is how has your media work informed your poetic practice and vice versa? Yun po.
Well, I think the mission of journalism, media work, bilang mamamahayag, diba? To reveal. And oftentimes, what we are doing in media is we are trying to make apparent the relationships in our world. You know, with this corruption, you know, why is it happening? But who's responsible for it? Who's in control of the funds? Why are they doing these things? Why are they getting away with it, right? Our job in the media is to make those things that seem hidden apparent, so that we can dismantle them and impose and fight for justice, right? We cannot effectively do that if these things remain hidden. So a lot of our mission, I think, in media work is to make apparent the relationships and how our world operates, how our society operates. And the task of a poet is similar in some ways. You are making apparent the relationships in the world, whether it is through the poetic voice or by using imagery and metaphor and rhythm. And what you're doing is you're revealing to your reader a truth, an experience that you've had. And finally, I would just say, as a poet, hopefully what you're also doing is you're bringing your listener or your reader to a place where they can contemplate, or they can, as we've said several times, ruminate on a particular issue or an image or emotion or feeling, because those spaces are rare and they're precious. And the more, we're on our phones and social media and have all these pressures, the smaller that space becomes. And what poetry can do is create a space for you to reflect on these important things. So I would say bringing some of that poetic voice, the poetic technique into media can be beneficial on how we create texts, how we reveal things, and also how we read texts that come before us.
All right, there's still 5 minutes. Does anyone want to ask a final one? Okay, I guess everyone's clapping. So, there will be... I think... Ay, po, sir. Okay. Hindi pa po ako ready. Ako yung hindi ready. On behalf of the College of Media and Communication, the Department of Broadcast Communication, and in light of our CMC Diamond Anniversary Talks, we wish to present this certificate to Sir Dorian Merina for his talk, Yndio Arxipelago, the Poetics of Media and the Promise of Poetry. All right, everyone. I hope that you have had very clear takeaways from today's discussion. All right. Sana ma-inform ang poetics nyo and understand that you are creative and critical people, and there is promise in that. Okay. If there's anything to take away from it, also is that it is painful, but also that pain is good because better, kesa manhid tayo, di ba? So, pain can also be productive and pleasurable. Kasi di ba, pag binili niyo yung libro, mag-enjoy kayo. It will be a pleasurable read. By the way, the book is for sale outside of the CMC Audi for, I believe, a launch price of, a special price of like 360 po. Okay. Regular price is 450. So, kung bibili na kayo, bumili na kayo today. Andito si Sir Dorian. Sir, are you willing to autograph your books po? Oh, pwede daw po. So, patulan na po natin. Maliban pa dun, sa pagkakaalam ko, may snacks po tayo sa likod. So, it's also time to mingle. If you have questions that you were too shy to ask Sir Dorian or Sir Alwin, then make it happen. Alright? Kainan na po. Ay! Picture pa po pala. I am really bad at hosting. Alright, madlang people, tara po sa harap para po makita yung screen ng TV sa ating picture. Students, teachers, colleagues, tara na po sa harap.
Sa baba kayo sir, tapos papatayin. Sige.
Ay, okay lang.
Sa likod nila.
Sir, kung for book signing, doon na lang po yung book signing. Tapos, may snacks po tayo. Please get your snacks. And then sa gilid po, may mga QR code for the evaluation. Na lang po,
I-disseminate po. Okay
QR
po.
code. Salamat po.